The Ardennes in winter stripped war of color and reduced it to shape and sound. Snow lay packed hard beneath blackened trees, and fog pressed low against the forest like a held breath. Along a frozen tree line, silhouettes began to gather, not scattered, not cautious, but layered in depth. They moved with the steadiness of something heavier than intent. Too many to count. Too unified to ignore. This was not movement. It was momentum. From a forward observation post, American observers watched through lenses clouded by frost and breath. They had learned to recognize patrols by hesitation, probes by restraint. What they saw now carried neither. Figures advanced with the confidence of mass, trusting that numbers themselves could overwhelm a thin defensive line. In that moment, the observers understood the old battlefield truth: some attacks are not meant to break positions, they are meant to drown them. Behind the line, artillery batteries waited in winter pits, crews operating by memory as much as sight. Charts were ready, grids pre-registered. Yet the terrain betrayed them. Standard fuses drove shells deep into snow and soft earth before detonation, turning violence inward instead of outward. Explosions were loud, powerful, and inefficient. Steel buried itself where men were not. Timing that worked on dry ground failed here, swallowed by mud and silence. Then the radio crackled with a request that carried weight beyond its words. Not a new fire mission. Not an adjustment. A breach. Use the round not authorized for this kind of fight. The one discussed in staff rooms but absent from infantry doctrine. A shell whose value lay not only in what it did, but in what the enemy must never be allowed to study. At command level, hesitation followed immediately. Not from mercy and not from doubt about effectiveness. The fear was older and colder. Ground battles leave remnants. Duds are recovered. Fragments are studied. A single unexploded shell could hand the enemy a technology meant to remain invisible. Secrecy, here, was not paranoia, it was strategy. But the observer did not argue theory. He argued time. If the line breaks tonight, he said, the war changes shape. In the Ardennes, collapse did not mean retreat, it meant roads opened, supply hubs exposed, and momentum reversing faster than maps could be redrawn. This was not about tomorrow's advantage. It was about the next hour. Permission came quietly. The first shell did not strike the earth. It opened in the air above the trees, an unnatural pause, a sudden white rupture suspended in fog. Fragments spread downward where bodies could not burrow away. In the observer's glass, movement slowed. Then scattered. Then stopped feeling inevitable. What had advanced as a single will dissolve into hesitation and silence. And as the forest absorbed the echoes, one question lingered in the cold air: why had a weapon this effective ever been forbidden to use at all? Modern battle rarely rewarded the thin line. A company spread across a ridge could hold until it was asked to hold against weight. When numbers arrived together, even disciplined defenders could be smothered by the simple mathematics of bodies and minutes. Firepower mattered, but so did saturation. A line could be brave and still be overrun, not because it lacked courage, but because it lacked depth. Human waved was never a formal doctrine on paper. It was a perception born in the men who had to face it. In fog, in snow, in smoke, a massed assault did not feel like tactics. It felt like weather, an advancing front that did not negotiate. Individual faces disappeared inside the larger motion, and what remained was the pressure of many feet moving at once, each step borrowing confidence from the steps behind it. Machine guns were designed for this kind of moment. They could cut lanes through infantry, stitch the air with disciplined bursts, and turn open ground into a measured killing space. But battlefields were not parade grounds. Terrain broke lines of sight, folds in the earth offered brief concealment, and smoke turned accuracy into guesswork. And sometimes density itself became protection, because even if a gunner was perfect, he could not fire in every direction at once. Artillery, in theory, was the great answer: shells that could reach where rifles could not, explosions that could break formations before they arrived. Yet artillery had its own limitations, especially against moving infantry in difficult ground. A shell that burst too late threw fragments behind the advancing line. A shell that detonated too low buried its effect into soil. In winter conditions, snow and mud absorbed violence with indifferent efficiency, swallowing what should have been decisive. What the defender wanted was not simply more explosive force. The defender wanted control, precision not just of distance, but of time and height. He needed the burst to happen when the enemy was most exposed and where cover offered the least protection. He needed steel to arrive from above because the ground was already crowded with earthworks, trees, and the deceptive safety of shallow depressions. That wish becomes the hinge of this story because the Allies already possessed an answer. It existed not as a rumor, but as an object, a shell whose detonation was not dependent on perfect timing or luck with terrain. It could turn artillery into something closer to a ceiling, fragmentation arriving downward, indifferent to snow and shallow cover. But the cruel irony was this: the most effective tool was sometimes the one commanders refused to use. Not because it was too brutal. Not because of mercy. But because in war, secrecy can be a weapon, and losing it can cost more than the battle in front of you. And as the pressure of mass continued to build in those winter forests, the question sharpened into something unavoidable: how long can a secret be protected when the line itself is beginning to bend? Long before it reached a winter tree line, the idea began in places that did not smell like cordite. It began in laboratories, in proving grounds, in workshops where the language of war was translated into circuits and tolerances. Engineers pursued a radical proposition, a fuse that would not wait for impact, and would not rely on a timed guess, but would detonate when it sensed it was close enough. The shell would decide for itself when the moment was right. The concept, spoken plainly, sounded almost gentle. Proximity. Sensing. A small intelligence inside a blunt instrument. But the technical reality was brutal. Artillery shells did not travel politely. They were slammed forward by an explosion, spun at high rotation for stability, and forced through cold air at high speed. Inside that spinning steel body, anything delicate had a tendency to die instantly. To place electronics inside a shell meant asking miniature components to survive launch shock, violent acceleration, and the constant vibration of flight, then function perfectly, every time, in freezing weather. That was why the breakthrough felt improbable. This was the 1940s, an era of vacuum tubes, thick wiring, and equipment that often failed even when protected. Yet engineers managed to shrink the necessary circuitry into a form that could endure the gun's violence. What began as a prototype became a kind of prophecy, the moment war stopped being only chemistry and steel and started becoming timing and sensing. Early success came where the risk was worth the reward, against aircraft. Anti-aircraft gunners had always fought a problem of prediction, estimating altitude, speed, and the exact second a shell should burst. With a proximity fuse, the shell did not need perfect timing. It only needed to pass near its target. The result was a new kind of airburst, detonations triggered by sensing rather than guesswork, turning the sky itself into a lethal envelope. And because it worked, it became dangerous in a different way. Command classified it tightly, not out of pride, but fear. If an enemy recovered an unexploded fuse, the secret might not remain secret for long. A captured example could be dissected, studied, replicated. The advantage would evaporate. In war, invention is not only about building something new, it is about preventing the other side from building the same thing. So a rule was written with the cold logic of strategy: use it where duds were unlikely to be retrieved. Preferably over water. Preferably against aircraft. And as the paper hardened into policy, the weapon existed like a locked door, real, available, and officially not for infantry. Which meant that on the ground, where bodies could be counted and secrets could be salvaged, the Allies held a miracle in reserve and waited for the moment when reserve would start to look like refusal. In wartime, bans are rarely written for one reason. They are written where several fears meet and where one fear outweighs all others. The prohibition on using the proximity fuse against ground targets was not a moral gesture. It was strategic logic made into policy. If the enemy learned how it worked, the advantage would vanish overnight. A weapon like that did not belong only to the battlefield where it was fired. It belonged to every future battle it could influence and to every enemy workshop that might copy it. The air was one thing, The ground was another. Over water, over open sky, a shell that failed was usually lost, swallowed by distance, sunk beyond reach. But ground battles produced a different kind of aftermath. They produced salvage. They produced craters that could be searched, fragments that could be collected, and dud rounds that might sit half-buried in mud until someone with patience and training dug them out. War left debris behind, and debris was information. Commanders understood that modern armies did not only fight with rifles and guns. They fought with engineers. Behind the front lines, there were men whose job was to study what fell into their hands. A captured machine gun could be copied. A new tank design could be imitated. And a proximity fuse, small, complex, improbable, was exactly the kind of treasure an enemy technical team would work day and night to understand. One intact example was not simply a curiosity. It was a shortcut through years of research. That fear shaped the language of the decision. Officers worried that a single recovered fuse could shorten the war for the wrong side or lengthen it for everyone. If Germany learned to build it, Allied aircraft would face denser and smarter anti-aircraft fire. Allied infantry would face airbursts of their own. The battlefield would become more lethal in both directions, and any temporary advantage would become a shared danger. In that sense, secrecy was not merely protection. It was containment. So the rule hardened. Artillery would fight with older fuses, impact, time, delay, tools that were powerful but imperfect against moving infantry in difficult terrain. Staff officers could justify it on paper. Conventional methods were adequate. Ammunition was plentiful. Fire missions could be massed. In the calculus of headquarters, effectiveness could be rebuilt through volume and discipline. The secret, meanwhile, remained locked away for the larger war. On the line, it felt different. Gunners and forward observers lived close enough to consequences that adequate had a measurable price. They saw shells bury into soft ground and waste their fragmentation. They watched enemy infantry keep moving after near misses that should have ended the advance. They corrected fire under fog and snow, knowing that the smallest timing error could turn an artillery mission into noise. And somewhere in their awareness was the bitter knowledge that a better answer existed, real, manufactured, stored, yet withheld by policy. This is where institutional morality appears, not as virtue, but as burden. Commanders had to weigh immediate lives against long-term advantage. A colonel authorizing the use of the fuse might save a platoon tonight, but risk arming the enemy for the next year. A general denying its use might condemn men in the short term, but preserve an edge that could protect thousands later. The decision was not clean. It was arithmetic performed with human lives. And arithmetic became doctrine. The secret stays secret, even if it costs more shells and more men today. In staff rooms, that belief felt disciplined, almost necessary. At the front, it felt like fighting with one hand closed. But belief is strongest right before it is tested. Because somewhere ahead, in snow and shadow, the war was arranging a moment when the rule would no longer feel like strategy, it would feel like surrender. By late 1944, American artillery was not merely a weapon. It was a system, industrial in scale, deliberate in method, and increasingly modern in its coordination. Radios stitched the front to the rear. Forward observers operated like eyes borrowed by distant guns, calling fire through fog and tree line as if distance were a solvable problem. Mapped grids, pre-registered targets, standardized procedures, everything about the machine was designed to turn chaos into schedule. In that system, speed was a form of protection. A request for fire could pass from a cold foxhole to a battery command post in seconds, translated into coordinates and corrections, then answered by steel arriving from miles away. It was one of the quiet revolutions of the war. Men who might never see the target could still shape it, because the language of artillery had become precise enough to travel through wire and air. From this grew a distinctly modern concept, time on target. Not simply firing many rounds, but making many guns deliver their rounds at the same instant, so the enemy received no warning shot, no gradual build. The first explosion would arrive with the last. In theory, it was mathematical violence, a synchronized moment where surprise and mass belonged to the defender, not the attacker. But even the most disciplined system still depended on one fragile thing: timing in the physical world. Shells followed arcs that could be calculated, but not perfectly controlled. The burst still relied on a fuse, and the fuse still relied on assumptions about distance, about height, about whether the ground would harden or swallow. Physics could blunt perfection without caring how well the paperwork was written. At higher command, there was a faith that conventional methods were enough if properly applied. Firepower could compensate for thin lines. Discipline could compensate for uncertainty. If a mission was ineffective, the answer was often framed as refinement, more adjustment, more rounds, more coordination. The system was good, therefore it would hold. That belief was not irrational, it was built on experience. Again and again, American artillery had stabilized fronts, broken attacks, and saved infantry units from being crushed. And from that experience grew a wartime habit: optimism disguised as doctrine. The assumption that the existing machine, properly used, could absorb any new pressure. That assumption was comforting because it was measurable. It gave commanders something they could control: schedules, allocations, rates of fire. In a war defined by uncertainty, a system that could be trusted felt like a moral anchor. Then winter terrain began to expose the weak point. In snow and soft earth, shells that would have shattered bodies instead sank, detonating too low or too late. In fog and broken ground, bursts that should have cut an advancing formation instead scattered harmlessly behind it. Against massed infantry, timing errors multiplied. The system still produced enormous force, but force alone was not the same as effect. The irony was quiet and sharp. The Allied artillery machine could be excellent, organized, responsive, relentless, and still be missing the one component that changed everything. A system can be perfectly built and still fail at the moment when conditions shift by a few inches of snow and a few seconds of timing. And as the pressure of winter assaults continued to build, the question was no longer whether American firepower was strong. The question was whether strength without the right timing was enough, especially when a forbidden solution already existed, waiting behind policy like an unopened door. The men moving through the Ardennes were not ghosts, and they were not a myth. They were trained soldiers operating inside a plan, guided by officers who understood the arithmetic of modern war. Concentration and speed could do what elegance could not. If enough infantry arrived quickly enough, the defenders' line, thin, cold, spread across forest and ridge, would be forced to make choices it could not afford. Hold too long and be surrounded. Pull back too early and open the road. Momentum was not an emotion. It was a method. They trusted the environment as an ally. Winter did not only slow vehicles and stiffen fingers, it shortened vision. Fog narrowed the world to a few dozen yards. Darkness hid movement and blurred distances. Forest terrain broke up observation posts and weakened the defender's ability to see the whole picture. Under those conditions, a well-timed push did not have to be subtle. It only had to be continuous. The attacker did not need perfection, he needed the defender to lose clarity. They also trusted the ground itself to soften the blow of incoming fire. Snow and mud did not stop artillery, but they changed how it worked. Bursts that should have ripped formations apart could be muffled, their fragmentation swallowed or misdirected by soft earth. A shell that buried itself before detonating might still terrify, but terror was not the same as stopping power. The attacker counted on that distinction. He believed the defender's artillery would sound heavy and still fail to cut deep enough. And they trusted pressure to create gaps. Not through brilliance, but through fatigue and overload. Defensive positions were often isolated pockets connected by radio, not by continuous trenches. If those pockets were hit in depth, some would break earlier than others. The attacker did not need every assault group to succeed. He needed one seam to open, one road junction, one ridge, one village edge, and then the larger force could pour through and widen it. The final trust was psychological. Soldiers who saw too many figures advancing, especially in poor visibility, could begin to imagine encirclement before it was real. The mind does not calculate the full order of battle in fog. It counts impressions. A line that believed it was about to be overwhelmed might retreat even before contact, and a retreat in winter forests could turn into panic simply because the terrain offered no clear way out. The attacker knew this, and he relied on it. Not as cruelty, but as understanding. This is where arrogance enters, not as boasting, but as assumption. The assumption that the defender's answers were already known. Rifles, machine guns, conventional artillery. The assumption that nothing fundamentally new would arrive in the next hour. In war, that belief is often reasonable. Most nights, the enemy does not change the rules. The assault's real power, then, was not individual bravery. It was the mathematics of mass, density creating momentum, momentum creating fear, fear creating collapse. Numbers arriving together could become a weapon that behaved like force of nature, not a series of decisions. And in the Ardennes, that logic had succeeded before. But mathematics has a weakness: it depends on conditions staying the same. It depends on the defender being limited to horizontal fire, on bursts happening too low, too late, too absorbed by Earth. It depends on men believing the safest direction is forward. And what the attackers did not know, moving under fog and winter branches, was that a single fuse could make height into a weapon and turn the very density they relied upon into their most dangerous mistake. The fight narrowed as visibility collapsed. Fog pressed into the trees, snow drifted through the air in small, steady grains, and smoke from earlier fires hung low like a second weather system. Forward observers worked from half-seen positions, radios tucked close to their bodies for warmth, calling missions into a world they could barely measure. Corrections came in meters and seconds, but the battlefield offered only vague shapes, movement without clear edges, sound without clean direction. When the shells arrived, they struck the ground with authority and disappeared into it. Soft earth and packed snow absorbed the first violence, and detonations that should have been decisive became strangely inefficient. The explosions were powerful, craters opened, trees shook, concussion rolled through the forest, but the fragmentation that mattered most was dulled or misdirected. Against moving infantry using folds in the terrain, the bursts felt late, low, and wasteful. Men who should have been caught in open ground instead reappeared between trunks and shallow depressions, still advancing. The gun crews responded the way artillery crews always responded when effect did not match effort: they increased volume. More rounds were lifted from stacks, more charges set, more tubes fired. The work was mechanical and relentless, hands numbed by cold, routines carried out with the discipline of men who understood that every delay had a human cost somewhere forward. But volume brought strain. Barrels heated and cooled unevenly. Ammunition handlers moved heavier loads for longer. Time was lost in the simple act of feeding the guns fast enough to keep pace with the crisis. At the observation post, the distance closed in ways that maps could not explain. A microbeat unfolded in silence between radio calls. The observer paused and listened. Not for gunfire was constant, but for footsteps and distant voices, the low murmur of men moving through trees. It was closer than it should have been. The assault was tightening its grip faster than corrections could chase it. Fire missions adjusted, but the enemy did not wait for accuracy to improve. Behind the line, the command chain argued in the language of responsibility. Preserve the secret or preserve the position. One choice guarded the future. The other guarded the present. In theory, those were the same thing. In practice, winter battles had a way of separating them. The audience begins to see the battlefield truth that doctrine rarely admits: sometimes you do not lose because you are weaker. You lose because you are too slow to change. And so the request went up again, more urgent now, stripped to politeness. Permission for the prohibited round, just this once, because if the line breaks here, the map will not be redrawn slowly. It will be rewritten in a single night. Somewhere in the rear, a decision waited to be made, and the forest kept moving. The proximity fuse was not magic, but it behaved like one in the conditions that made other weapons falter. It did not ask a forward observer to guess the perfect second. It did not rely on a shell striking the earth at just the right angle. It carried its own judgment, an internal sensing mechanism that searched the space around it and triggered detonation when it came close enough to a target to matter. In practice, that meant the explosion happened where it was most lethal, not where habit and hope placed it. On paper, the change looked small, the same caliber guns, the same ammunition weight, the same propellant charges. But in the air above a battlefield, the difference was profound. A timed fuse could be brilliant when calculations held and wasteful when they did not. A percussion fuse could be decisive on hard ground and muted in snow. The proximity fuse turned those uncertainties into a narrower problem. It did not need perfect conditions. It needed only proximity, and the chaos of battle supplied plenty of that. Airburst was the geometry that infantry feared for a reason. When a shell detonated above ground, fragmentation expanded outward and downward, filling the space where men moved and breathed. Earthworks and shallow depressions, so reliable against flat trajectories, offered less safety when steel arrived from above. In forests, airburst became even more punishing. Branches that might have concealed movement now became part of the violence, splintered and thrown, turning cover into hazard. The burst did not simply damage, it imposed itself vertically into the one direction the ground could not easily shield. This was why the fuse mattered in winter. Snow and mud could swallow an impact explosion, but they could not swallow air. A shell that burst in open air delivered its full effect regardless of what lay beneath. It was not stronger than conventional artillery. It was more correctly placed, detonating at a height where fragments were most likely to intersect moving infantry. It made timing and altitude the weapon, not just explosive force. And it reduced the burden on the men trying to apply fire under pressure. Forward observers still had to locate and adjust, but they no longer had to fight the extra battle of perfect fuse settings while visibility failed. Under fog and smoke, when corrections arrived late and estimates were imperfect, the proximity fuse acted like a narrow mercy, one less variable that could betray them. A microbeat played out at the gun line when the rounds arrived. A gunner handled them differently, not with superstition, but with awareness. The shell carried secrecy as surely as it carried explosive. It was checked, passed, loaded with a care that felt almost ceremonial. In the choreography of the crew, the pace did not slow, but the attention sharpened. Everyone understood that this ammunition did not belong to routine fire. Because the strategic fear was real. Any dud was a gift. A shell that failed to detonate could be recovered, dissected, understood. It could be carried back through enemy lines and opened in a workshop under clean light, where violence became information. In that sense, every round fired was both a solution and a risk, a weapon that could save a position and simultaneously endanger an advantage. This is what innovation looked like in the middle of a world war. Not a larger shell, not a louder explosion, not a new gun. A smarter moment. A fraction of a second chosen correctly, at the right height, transforming artillery from something that struck the earth into something that owned the air above it. And once commanders understood what that meant, once they saw how geometry could break momentum, the next question was no longer technical. It was political, moral, and immediate. Who would be willing to break the rule and sign their name to the risk? The reports arriving at headquarters carried a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Lines were thinning, not because units had vanished, but because they were being stretched to the edge of endurance. Companies that had held through earlier attacks now reported exhaustion in simple terms: ammunition low, men cold, positions scraped into ground that refused to cooperate. And the assaults did not arrive as single blows. They came in depth, a steady arrival of fresh figures behind the first, as if the forest itself was feeding the attack forward. Commanders did what commanders are trained to do: they calculated risk. Not in abstract phrases, but in concrete outcomes. If the position collapsed, the enemy would gain ground, and ground meant more than geography. It meant road junctions, supply routes, command posts, and the possibility of capturing material that could not be evacuated fast enough. And if the line broke badly, the very secrecy they were trying to protect might be lost anyway, swept up in the debris of retreat and surrender. The logic began to turn against itself. Holding the secret by losing the line was no longer a coherent strategy. That was when the moral weight sharpened into a decision that could not be postponed. Protect the fuse for the coming months, or protect men for the next hour. It was an ugly trade because both arguments were true. Secrecy saved lives in the long view, survival saved lives in the immediate. War forced leaders to choose which horizon mattered more, and then live with the consequence either way. A micro-beat unfolded in an office lit by maps and winter lamps. An officer took a form, authorization, directive, a small piece of paper that carried enormous meaning, and signed it. It was not dramatic. It was final. He understood, in the same instant, that the decision could not be unsent. Once the ammunition was fired, it would exist in the world, fragments on the ground, risks in the snow, possibilities in enemy hands. When the batteries received the instruction, it did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with quiet intensity. Gun crews read the order, looked at the rounds, and understood that this was not routine fire. The procedures were the same: load, set, fire, but the stakes had changed. They were about to employ something whose value had been guarded like a national secret, now entrusted to cold hands in a muddy gun pit. Forward observers adjusted their language immediately. Calls became shorter, more precise, urgent without being emotional. Coordinates tightened. Corrections were clipped. There was no time for long explanation because the window was closing and the enemy was still moving. A war that could be discussed in staff meetings had become a war measured in minutes. This was the hinge the audience can feel, policy bending under pressure, a locked door opening onto the battlefield. The question was no longer whether the forbidden round would work. The question was what would happen the first time it burst over men who believed momentum could not be interrupted. The first proximity-fused shells did not announce themselves the way infantry expected artillery to announce itself. There was no heavy impact into earth, no delayed detonation smothered by snow. Instead, the explosions arrived suspended high over the tree line, like sudden punctuation in a sentence that had been running too long. White flashes opened in midair, brief and absolute, and for a moment the fog itself seemed to recoil. In the Ardennes, where the forest usually swallowed sound and movement, the sky had begun to speak. The advancing formation reacted with the instincts of men who had survived other barrages. They ducked. They hugged the ground. They pressed into shallow folds they had trusted minutes before. But airburst was not a threat that could be outrun by sprinting forward or defeated by lying flatter. Fragmentation traveled outward and down, arriving from a direction the earth could not block. The momentum of the assault, built on speed, density, and psychological pressure, stuttered as bodies learned a new geometry. From the defenders' side, the difference was immediate and unmistakable. Observers who had watched shells vanish into soft ground now saw bursts where they needed to be, when they needed to be. Fire that had previously sounded powerful but felt blunt suddenly gained sharpness. The same guns, the same crews, the same cold routines, yet the effect on the field shifted as if an invisible hand had lifted the explosions into the air and placed them precisely above the moving line. Cohesion began to fracture in ways that did not require a total collapse to be decisive. Leaders tried to keep units moving, to close gaps, to maintain direction through fog and noise. But airbursts imposed confusion without needing to be seen. Orders could not compete with the instinct to find cover. Runners hesitated. Small groups flattened behind trees or slid into ditches that offered only imagined safety. The assault still existed, but its shape was breaking apart into fragments of its own, isolated men, separated intentions, momentum turned into individual survival. A micro-beat unfolded through binoculars. An American observer watched movement slow, then scatter, then hesitate. Not because he could see every casualty, fog and forest hid the detail, but because he could read rhythm. The enemy's advance had possessed a steady tempo, like footsteps in unison. Now that tempo was changing. Forward motion became uncertain, interrupted by pauses that grew longer with each burst. In minutes, an attack that had felt inevitable began to look negotiable. This was the turning truth that made the weapon more than a technical improvement. Airburst did not merely kill. It unmakes certainty. It reaches into the assumption that the safest place is the ground, that the best answer to artillery is to endure it and keep moving. It replaces confidence with calculation and calculation with doubt. And doubt in massed infantry spreads faster than orders can correct. The battlefield's tone changed accordingly. What had been a push forward became a search for cover, urgent, constant, and increasingly unrewarding. Trees that once hid movement now drew fire. Depressions that once offered protection now felt shallow. Men who had advanced with the comfort of numbers now discovered that density invited punishment from above. And as the airbursts continued to hang over the tree line like cold flashes of decision, the defenders began to realize something else. If a few shells could rewrite an assault, then an entire coordinated strike might do more than stop it, it might erase it. Once the first airbursts proved the principle, the defenders reached for the next level of the system, coordination. Batteries that had been firing in response now began to speak to one another through procedure and radio discipline, arranging a concentrated strike. It was not a single gun's answer, but many guns sharing one moment. Time on target was designed to deny the enemy warning, and with the forbidden round, that denial became sharper. The sky itself was about to receive a schedule. The shells arrived in near-simultaneous waves, and the battlefield tilted upward. Detonations opened above the trees and over the broken ground, fragmenting in volumes that could not be understood as individual bursts. Shock and steel came from a direction the earth could not block. Foxholes and shallow ditches, so reassuring against horizontal fire, felt suddenly incomplete. Men could press into the ground and still be found by fragments falling through air, threading between branches, striking where protection had been assumed. For the attackers, the logic of mass inverted. Density had been their strength because it created momentum and psychological pressure. Now density became a liability because every extra body in the same patch of ground multiplied confusion and slowed movement. Units that needed to flow forward found themselves tangled, men colliding in the instinct to seek cover, small groups breaking away, direction dissolving into a series of personal decisions. The wave could not remain a wave when the air above it belonged to someone else. Command and control degraded under that invisible pressure. Runners could not cross open gaps without being caught under bursts. Radios, already strained by cold and terrain, lost the ability to coordinate movement when leaders were forced down, pinned by an enemy they could not directly see. Orders arrived late or not at all. And without reliable control, a massed assault becomes what it fears most, a crowd without shape. At the gun line, far from the tree line, a microbeat played out with quiet precision. A crew worked with mechanical calm, lift, load, set, fire, each motion repeated as if nothing extraordinary was happening. But they understood what the paperwork could not show. Speed now equaled survival for someone they would never meet. Every round sent on time was a few more seconds of stability for infantry holding cold ground under pressure. The assault did not break with theatrical suddenness. It broke the way momentum breaks in deep snow, gradually, then completely. Forward motion slowed, then became intermittent, then ceased to be an advance at all. The battlefield did not show a single collapse, it showed the disappearance of intent. Men still existed in the forest, but the formation no longer did. And the revelation landed in restrained language, the way soldiers speak when truth is too large for celebration. What had been a wave became scattered individuals. The line held. But as the last shells faded into the winter air, another problem emerged. Success on the ground meant risk in the snow, and the secret now lay closer to enemy hands than ever. As the assault stalled and forward motion faded into scattered, uncertain shapes, the defenders discovered that success carried its own danger. A broken attack left ground behind, craters, shattered trees, abandoned equipment, and the quiet spaces where an enemy could return later with patience. If the forbidden rounds had done their work properly, fragments would be everywhere. But the fear lived in the exceptions. One unexploded shell, half buried in snow, could become a prize more valuable than a captured rifle. Victory, in this case, increased the risk of enemy recovery. The response from command was immediate and controlled. Orders emphasized fire discipline, use the rounds only where necessity justified the risk. Do not waste them. Do not scatter them across secondary targets. Keep records. Limit exposure. War demanded aggression, but secrecy demanded restraint, and the two impulses now had to share the same battlefield. The ammunition was treated like a tool and a liability at once, employed with the quiet caution normally reserved for fragile instruments. Where possible, batteries were instructed to displace quickly after firing. The logic was practical. The gun position that remained too long invited counter-battery fire, and counter-battery fire could force a hurried withdrawal, leaving behind ammunition, packaging, paperwork, anything that might hint at what had been used. Crews packed and moved through cold mud and snow, not because they feared defeat, but because they feared what the enemy might find in their absence. The war was being fought, now, in physical ground and in information. On the forward edge, infantry patrols moved with cautious purpose. They were not hunting only for enemy stragglers. They were watching the terrain the way scavengers would, alert to anything unusual, anything that looked like a shell that had failed to function. Unexploded rounds could not be left for inspection. If one was found, it had to be reported, secured, destroyed if possible. In the fog and ruined forest, the line was held not only by rifles but by vigilance. A microbeat unfolded in the mind of an officer who understood the scale of what had happened. He looked at the map, at the position saved, at the casualty reports that could have been worse, and then he thought about tomorrow. Would victory tonight cost? Advantage tomorrow? Would the use of the fuse shorten the war by holding the line, or endanger the wider campaign by giving the enemy a glimpse of the future? The question did not have a clean answer, because war rarely offers one. It simply offers trades and the requirement that someone choose. The weapon itself was not mythologized in the paperwork. It was filed into the system like any other munition, issued, accounted for, rationed. It was not described as miraculous. It was described as effective. But beneath the ordinary language was an awareness everyone shared. This was not merely more firepower. It was a change in how firepower behaved, and therefore a change in how men moved under it. That is the deeper resolution. The ban had been broken, and the world did not return to the old rules. Once a capability is used in desperation and proves decisive, it becomes harder to argue for restraint the next time the line bends. Secrecy remained, but the precedent had been set in winter air above the trees. And as the front settled into a tense quiet, men listening again for movement, commanders reading the night for its next intention, the war carried forward a new lesson. When survival demands it, policy yields, and doctrine begins to shift in ways no order can fully control. When the firing stopped and the line steadied, the war did what it always did next. It wrote reports. After-action summaries moved upward through channels, translated from exhausted observations into the language of doctrine. They described something that sounded simple but carried lasting weight. Airburst had shown a new effectiveness against massed infantry in open or lightly covered ground. Where conventional fire had bruised and delayed, the proximity bursts had interrupted. Where a wave had depended on momentum, the air had become an obstacle. For commanders trained to see battle in horizontal terms, roads, ridges, distances on a map, this was a subtle revolution. The reports forced them to think in vertical space. Height was no longer a background detail of terrain. It became a tactical dimension, something that could be controlled and exploited. A few yards of altitude at the moment of detonation could matter as much as 100 yards of range. The battlefield was not only spread across the earth, it existed above it. Conventional fuses did not become obsolete. Impact and time settings still had their places: bunkers, buildings, hard ground, targets where penetration mattered. But their limitations were now felt more sharply because the comparison had been made in blood and winter. Once soldiers had seen shells burst at the right height without perfect calculation, it became harder to accept the old inefficiencies as unavoidable. What had once been good enough began to look like preventable waste. A microbeat surfaced in the recollections of infantrymen who had survived the night. They described a rare feeling, not often granted to men in foxholes, that the system behind them had finally matched the enemy's method. The attacker had relied on mass and timing. Now the defender's firepower had answered with its own timing, delivered from a dimension the assault could not easily solve. It was not comfort. It was alignment, technology meeting reality on the terms the battlefield demanded. Inside the institution, the shift was predictable and quiet. Once a capability is proven, it becomes harder to justify withholding it. The arguments for secrecy did not vanish, but they weakened under operational evidence. Every new request for the fuse would point back to the same conclusion: it worked, and it saved lines that might otherwise have broken. Policy could still restrict it, but the mental door had already opened. The enemy, too, felt the change even if they did not fully understand it. Tactics began to adapt in the only ways available: more dispersion, more cover-seeking, more caution in massing at the forest edge. Certainty had been punctured. A push that once depended on density now carried the fear that density could invite destruction from above. That was the strategic consequence. A secret tool reshaped behavior on both sides, even when used sparingly. And in war, once behavior changes, the next battles are never fought on the same terms again. In the long ledger of military invention, the proximity fuse marks a turning point not because it changed what artillery was, but because it changed what artillery could think about. For centuries, guns had been extensions of muscle and metallurgy: powder, barrel, projectile, impact. The proximity fuse placed electronics inside that ancient chain and made timing itself an engineered feature. It was a marriage of disciplines that had rarely trusted each other: the blunt certainty of high explosives and the delicate logic of circuits. In 1944, that marriage was still young, almost unbelievable. Yet it foreshadowed an era in which sensing and timing would matter as much as explosive weight. Later wars would speak in the language of guidance, detection, and precision. They would treat the air as a domain to be measured and exploited, not merely crossed. The proximity fuse was not a guided weapon, but it carried the same philosophy: effectiveness comes from arriving at the right moment, in the right place, more than from simply arriving with more force. That is why commanders guarded it so fiercely. The audience is meant to remember the fear behind the ban. Copying it would have altered the balance quickly, because the advantage it offered was not incremental, it was structural. It improved anti-aircraft fire, it transformed airburst against infantry, and it reduced the margin of error that battle normally depends upon. If the enemy gained it, the change would not remain local. It would spread across fronts, across skies, across the war itself. Secrecy, in that light, was not superstition. It was containment of a future. A microbeat belongs not to a soldier but to an engineer, the kind of man whose war was fought with testing rigs and broken prototypes. He might have said, quietly, without pride, that the true miracle was not the idea. Many people can imagine a fuse that detonates near a target. The miracle was making that idea survive a gun's violence, launch acceleration measured in thousands of GS, rapid spin, cold air, vibration, and the indifferent brutality of mass production. The accomplishment was not inspiration. It was endurance, technology tough enough to be hurled through a barrel and still behave like an instrument. After the war, militaries absorbed the lesson in predictable ways. Smarter detonation often beat larger shells. Better timing could substitute for sheer weight. The logic of proximity would be refined, miniaturized, and reborn in other forms: radar fuses, improved sensors, new methods of controlling the instant when energy became lethal. The battlefield's future would increasingly belong to weapons that did not merely explode, but decided when to explode. And the story of the proximity fuse became a case study in innovation under fear, progress hidden inside bureaucracy. It shows how breakthroughs can be created, then locked away, not because leaders doubt them, but because leaders understand the danger of letting the future fall into enemy hands. It also shows how rules can be honest and still be broken, because no policy is written for every hour of a collapsing front. That is the legacy in its simplest form: quiet transformation. The battlefield changed without a new gun, only a new moment of detonation, an engineered instant in midair that rewrote what infantry could survive and what commanders could risk. And once war learns that time can be weaponized, the final question is not technical at all. It is moral. When a rule is made to protect tomorrow, how do you justify breaking it to save today? In the end, the ban deserves to be judged without cynicism. Secrecy was not a superstition, not a reflexive cruelty, and not a bureaucratic game. It was strategy, an attempt to keep a decisive advantage out of enemy hands in a war where captured technology could shift the balance faster than any division could march. The proximity fuse was protected because it mattered, and because leaders understood that progress, once stolen, can be turned back against the men who first built it. But the exception deserves to be judged just as honestly. There are moments in war when withholding power becomes the greater risk, not because the weapon is too precious, but because the line is too fragile. Survival creates pressures that policy cannot fully anticipate. A rule written to protect tomorrow can become a trap when tonight is the moment that decides whether there will be a tomorrow worth protecting. In those moments, command is forced to abandon purity and choose consequence. Turned a wave into mist sounds poetic, but on the battlefield it is a description of perception. What was dissolved was not only flesh, it was momentum. It was the certainty of massed movement, the confidence that numbers could roll forward like weather. Under airburst, that confidence scattered into smaller instincts: find cover, stop moving, listen for the next burst. Motion was undone not by a single explosion, but by a change in what the air above the trees meant. The paradox remains, and it is the honest center of the story. The same command that forbade the round also made the decision that saved men with it. The ban was not foolish, and the breach was not reckless. They were two sides of the same responsibility, protecting lives across different horizons. In war, leaders are not asked to choose between good and evil. They are asked to choose between costs and then bear them. So the final reflection is calm, because calm is the only tone that fits the arithmetic. War forces commanders to choose between tomorrow's advantage and tonight's lives, knowing both choices will be paid for. The proximity fuse was a secret guarded for the future, then released in a moment when the present threatened to collapse. The last image holds in the mind like a brief flash in winter fog, an airburst above frozen trees, bright, suspended, decisive, followed by drifting white and sudden quiet. They banned it for fear the enemy would steal it, until the night came when fear itself demanded it be used.